They called me a mistake. A whisper at family dinners, a shrug when I asked for help. Years later, that same family stood on a soot-streaked lawn as their world burned, the study gutted and a safe gone with the night. They turned to me, the one they'd tried to erase, asking me to piece together what they'd destroyed. I agreed, but not out of mercy. I wanted truth. What started as smoke and missing ledgers became a trail of shell companies, late-night vans, and a stranger who profited from our shame. Stay with me. I followed the clues, and what I found changed everything. It wasn't a line delivered once and forgotten. It was a phrase threaded through family dinners, tossed in passing like change, small, thoughtless, and heavy. It helped them keep me in a place where I could do no harm and take no space. I learned to be small. I learned to disappear. My name is Maya Bennett. I was raised in a brick bungalow on the north side of Chicago, a house that looked respectable from the street. Manicured shrubs, a flag that never drooped, lights on timers. But inside it was a machine tuned to make one person quiet. My mother had a voice that could scorch glass. My father had a pride that loved trophies more than children. My older sister, Claire, had that polished, faultless presence people say when they mean perfect. When I was 10, Claire hissed at me, "You were never meant to be here." Cunnel, my childhood friend turned brother in all but blood, shoved me in doorways and called me soft. My parents shrugged when I complained. "Don't start trouble," they said. I learned to sleep in small, efficient bursts and to make myself useful in ways that wouldn't draw attention. I saved every paycheck, took bookkeeping gigs, and at 25 I moved 2 neighborhoods away to a modest apartment in Logan Square. I found work at an indie publisher in the West Loop editing manuscripts. Other people's truths made tidy while mine stayed loose and raw. For years, solitude was defense. I liked it, kept me safe. And then one night in early March, everything my family depended on went up in smoke. I was halfway through a late copy edit when my phone buzzed. The caller ID said, "Home." My chest tightened. "Maya." My mother's voice came paper-thin through the receiver. "The house, fire. The study. The safe, gone. You need to come." The cab ride to my childhood block felt like running through someone else's memories. Streetlights smeared. The house I knew, walls I could map by sound, glowed like a bruised tooth in the night. Firefighters fought at the front. Neighbors clustered on lawns, faces lit orange and shocked. My mother stood in an overcoat, hair dusted with ash. Claire wiped her cheeks with the back of a soot-smudged hand. Cunnel looked like he'd aged 10 years in an hour. And they looked at me, relief plain as daylight. "You're here," Claire said, fingers shaking. "We need you. You know Dad's accounts. Please, Maya." Of all the things that could have happened, the simplest stung the worst. The people who had practiced calling me a mistake wanted me because I might fix the mess they'd made. The irony was a knife. I said no. My refusal would have been brave if it had been clean, but it wasn't. I was angry and I was tired. "You used to tell me to disappear," I said. "You called me a mistake." They fell into a chorus of apologies, guilt, and sobs. "We're drowning," Claire confessed later, in staccato sobs while firefighters shoveled embers from what used to be Dad's study. "We thought we could erase it and start fresh. We didn't know," we panicked. There's a particular flavor to desperation that smells like warmed metal and stale cologne. They wanted a miracle, and for reasons that were practical and bitter, they wanted me. I agreed to help, not for them but because I would not let their erasure stand. I wanted the truth, not mercy for them, not absolution, just the facts. The first thing I learned was that ashes keep secrets, even when everything else seems to have been taken. The study was a ruin of blackened shelves and curled paper. The old safe was gone, pried from its spot, taken during the chaos or the calm before it. Insurance adjusters came, eyes trained to spot fraud. The fire marshal called the blaze suspicious. The police spoke in careful phrases and promised an investigation that, in the real world, very often meant slow. I hired a private investigator, Nora, quick-eyed and colder than a bank vault, because domestic fires are so often dismissed as family business. Nora moved through the char, photographing, cataloging, and asking questions I hadn't considered. Together we traced the money. Where I expected a tidy mess, I found architecture. There were withdrawals and transfers labeled in the language of corporate camouflage, consulting fees, project reimbursements, and vendor settlements. Funds left my father's accounts in predictable monthly increments, reappeared in accounts under names like Prairie Holdings or Hawkbridge LC, and were then siphoned out again into foreign shell companies. Phone records showed short, disconnected calls after midnight. CCTV from a row of storefronts down the block caught a van at 2:13 a.m., its cargo door open for 17 minutes. A neighbor, Mr. Flores from the bodega, remembered seeing a man with a canister move quickly past the alley that night. That was when the story turned from an ugly family secret to something wider. A pattern of deliberate erasure and someone orchestrating it. I confronted my siblings in the remains of the kitchen. They were raw, Claire's eyes were rimmed in red and her fingers still smelled of smoke. Connell had iron-gray lines at his temples. "We're bankrupt," Claire said, voice fractured. "Dad, bad investments. We borrowed. We thought burning the records would reset everything. We thought it would be clean. They'd built a plan out of panic. They'd thought the fire would absolve them. They hadn't expected me to poke. They'd written me out of the narrative, convinced I wouldn't look. But I did. The dividing line between being pushed aside and stepping up is, for many of us, where shame ends and proof begins. I followed the money farther than my family had the stomach to go. The trail led unexpectedly to a development executive named Olivia Mercer. Polished, networked, and the kind of person who speaks in buffered tones that hide sharp edges. Olivia's company, Mercer Development, specialized in urban renewal, rezoning old blocks and flipping longtime tenants into high-end condos. She had the resources to move money smoothly and the arrogance to assume no one under her radar would look twice. I met her in a cafe with too bright lighting and a menu with prices that winked at privilege. She smelled faintly of citrus and very expensive shampoo. She smiled like someone who'd always had the wind at their back. "You can't just accuse me," she said, voice saxophone smooth. "People make their choices." "Choice?" I said. "You moved funds, seeded shell companies, and then advised my family to simplify their lives. You promised help. You took advantage." She laughed, thin and sharp. "You're dramatic, Miss Bennett. You see webs everywhere." Then softer. "Your family needed rewiring. I provided solutions. They chose to accept them. But evidence isn't moved by charm. There were contractual footnotes, emails with innocuous subject lines, and transfers that traced back to a bank account tied to a Mercer exec. I had Nora subpoena the CCTV, work through bank compliance officers, and get rare cooperation from a whistleblower in Mercy Development's finance department who resented his boss's hubris. I documented phone logs, bank statements, and a meeting where Olivia had presented the family with financial restructuring, a euphemism that came with strings. "We'll consolidate your liabilities," she told them, voice buttery, "if you let me manage the assets." When the family balked, the pressure increased. Do it or risk losing everything. Then the fire happened. It became clear that this wasn't solely about saving a floundering family. It was about leverage. Olivia and her associates stood to gain control over properties and holdings if they could eliminate the paper trail that proved ownership or debt. Burn the proof. Make claims easier to contest or absorb. It was a scheme built on shame and the quiet willingness of a family to hand over more than they intended to save themselves. When I took the case to the Chicago Police Department and then the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, I expected a professional shrug. Instead, the prosecutor assigned to our case, an older woman named Martinez with high cheekbones and a no-nonsense voice, listened. She saw criminal intent in the pattern and the evidence. But criminal cases are not novels where the villain is seized in a dramatic swoop. They are paper wars. Subpoenas, motions, witness lists, and depositions. I had to keep my stamina. The courtroom is an odd theater. Sterile, procedural, and finally human. My family sat there looking almost anonymous. The blush of shame, the hollow attempts at dignity. Claire's lips were thin. Connell didn't meet my eyes. When I testified, I felt the old smallness try to curl my spine. I read bank slips and email threads into the record. I watched Olivia Mercer's composed face crack into annoyed irritation when the prosecutor showed the ledger connection. Her legal team argued persuasion and technicality, but facts are stubborn. Olivia was indicted for fraud, conspiracy, and, crucially, for actions that tied her to tampering with financial records. The argument that she was merely an advisor dissolved when the prosecution revealed she'd actively arranged the shell accounts and pressured the family to simplify, while having a perfectly practical route to benefit. She had orchestrated the environment where erasure was possible and bankrolled the channels that made money disappear. Justice was not a single, satisfying slam of a gavel. The trial took months. Olivia's sentence was enough to mark consequence. She lost licensure on multiple development projects and paid restitution. The company restructured under court oversight. My family accepted plea agreements that combined restitution with community service and financial oversight. They paid penalties and learned the humbling arithmetic of public accounting. None of it made them saints. None of it returned the years of contempt I'd carried. What it did do was draw a line. Their treatment of me could no longer be masked by the older lie that I was a mistake. They had to reckon publicly with choices that had almost destroyed us all. After the trial, I had offers. Investigative journalists who wanted to tell the story, lawyers asking for interviews, and activists who wanted to use the case as a template for uncovering similar scams in cities across the Midwest. I started a small imprint that published first-person accounts of domestic fraud and systemic manipulation, a tiny operation in a West Loop loft where raw voices could finally be edited and amplified. I called it Beacon Press. My mother wrote me a letter months later, pages of apologies and trembling attempts at truth. "You were never a mistake," she wrote. I let fear decide for me. Claire wanted to rebuild a sisterhood in measured steps. Connell called sometimes when he needed help with a contractor. They were, predictably, imperfect people trying to learn something new. I met my mother in a cafe by the lake, the kind of place where tourists take pictures and locals drink coffee with scones. She reached across the small table and took my hand, eyes wet. "I was scared to fail," she said. "I used you as a scapegoat." There is a sharp difference between forgiveness and forgetting. Forgiveness for me was a practical act. I forgave because I wanted to stop carrying the weight that had been placed on me. I did not pretend the past hadn't happened. I simply refused to let it continue to define every decision I made. The lesson I carry with me is not a tidy moral. It is a set of hard-earned directives. First, labels are a theft. When someone calls you a mistake, they are trying to appropriate your identity into a story that absolves them. Don't let them. Second, document everything. Paperwork, emails, and receipts. These are the bones of truth. Shame thrives in the dark. Light it with paper and timestamps. Third, you may be raw and quiet, but those qualities often hone you into a better investigator of truth. Practice listening to the margins. They contain maps. Finally, justice is messy, slow, and never a perfect salve. It is also sometimes the last refuge against those who would profit from shame. I did not pursue punishment for the emotional satisfaction of watching my family fall. I pursued it because someone had exploited them and because I refused to let manipulation succeed. If you ever find yourself told you are a mistake, note this. The people who say it are rarely telling the truth about you. They are revealing something about themselves. Cowardice, fear, willingness to harm. That knowledge is power. Use it. Be meticulous. Tell the story. Gather evidence. Speak. They called me a mistake, until they needed me to fix everything. In fixing it, I learned that the label they handed me could be reclaimed, polished, and used as the heading of my next chapter. The justice we saw in the courtroom didn't erase the past, but it prevented someone else from lighting the same match. That, in a country where paper wins cases and persistence wins the rest, was enough. I stood on the courthouse steps and felt, for the first time in years, that the name I'd been given no longer fit me. The verdict didn't erase the years of whispers or the scars left by betrayal, but it did do something steadier. It made the truth visible, and it held those who profited from our shame to account. I forgave not because they were suddenly deserving, but because I needed to stop carrying their story as my burden. I rebuilt my life on clearer terms. Boundaries instead of silence, records instead of rumors, a voice instead of vanishing. The real victory wasn't a headline or a sentence. It was the quiet work that followed. Insisting on paperwork, refusing to be erased, and using what I'd learned to help others who live in the margins of family shame. If there's a single lesson, it's this. Being called a mistake is someone else's attempt to steal your agency. Don't give it to them. Protect your story, gather the facts, and let truth be your defense. So tell me, if the people who sidelined you suddenly needed you to save them, would you step in to fix everything, or would you walk away and keep the hard-won life you built for yourself? Subscribe to Famigraphic Show for more interesting stories.